Good morning, everyone. I'm here today to talk about Behat. But first, a little bit of history. About 6 years ago, I started working at a new company, and it was my first ever API backend only project. Before that, I was a full stack developer. We rolled our own CMS, as people did back then. But this was different. I had some experience with unit testing for my applications, but I wanted to do a bit more. I noticed that while doing unit tests, a lot of my stuff wasn't covered. The configuration wasn't covered, the routing wasn't covered well, and I wanted to do end-to-end testing. At first I tried to do that with PHP unit, which worked, but it was a bit of a hassle. Then at some point I learned about Behat, and I got into it and I started using it, and I'm really happy with how that turned out. We, in our company, it's now a staple. We use it for almost all of our backend projects, and I would very much like to share how we work with this with you today. So first off, Behat. Behat is a behavior testing tool. It tests the behavior of your application. It is written in PHP, and it's specifically for projects that are also written in PHP. The tests themselves are written in Gherkin, which is a testing language. The executed code is written in PHP, and Behat supports extensions, so it is easy to add more functionality to your tests if need be. And of course, there's documentation available. In this talk, I will tell a bit about installing Behat. I'll go into what Gherkin is and how to write tests in it. We'll talk about contexts and how to make sure that what is written in Gherkin is actually executed. A little bit about tags and hooks. Some backgrounds and scenario outlines. Some tips that we ran into over the time. And a little bit about why we actually use Behat this way. So installing Behat. First thing you do, composer require Behat. And don't forget the ---- dev. You do not want to have this on production. Besides that, we use the Mink extension. The Mink extension is a plugin for Behat that will allow you to act like a browser. With that comes the Mink browser kit driver. We have some open source contexts that we use. This is actually a fork of Behat, which is a project that isn't really maintained anymore. And because we use Symfony, we have the Symfony extension in there as well that helps with auto-wiring your context. When you install Behat as a Symfony, in a Symfony application, if you use Symfony Flex, it will install a whole bunch of files for you, and you'll already have this. If not, you have to add them manually. You need a features directory for your actual test files. By default, Symfony Flex will give you a test Behat directory for your context, but generally you can put your context anywhere you want. You need a config file, which is usually done from a behat.yaml.dist, where you have a behat.yaml file that is for local configuration if it differs from your distribution. Inside your YAML file, it'll look a little bit like this. You define your default suite. You define your list of contexts, and you describe the extensions that you want to use and how you want to use them. Mainly the base URL, which is where your test server will run. Mostly this is local host, unless you're fancy like me and use your own subdomains for everything. Gherkin. Gherkin is a testing language. It's not specifically for Behat or for PHP. I think it was done by the Cucumber project first, and maybe even before that. It's based in a given, when, then structure. You set up your test with given, make sure that all of the state for your application is there. Then you run the when part, which is the actual test, and then the then, where you make all your assertions to make sure that everything is okay. It's in plain English text, which means that you do not need any kind of programming experience to read the test. It's understandable, and your tests will be structured in features, and each feature has one or multiple scenarios, and in each scenario you define a bunch of steps. We'll go into the given first. You set up all your state. We usually start with an empty database. We make sure that there is something in that database that we need for that test. And sometimes we prepare the headers that we need to send during our test. The when part is the test itself. In the case of an API, you actually almost always execute things on your endpoints. And the then part, you check the response, you check the response type, and you make sure that things are okay in the database. So as a whole example, I have a test for deleting tasks. The feature is deleting tasks themselves, and as a scenario, I have, as a user, I can delete my task. Which means that, given there's a user, and there's a task owned by that same user, and I am logged in as that same user, when I send a delete request to tasks with that same ID, then the response should be a 402 and no content, and the task should not exist in the database anymore. The next test that I would run is to make sure that someone else cannot delete my task, which is almost similar to the previous test, only this task is owned by someone else. You see that the response should be different, and in the last bit, the task should actually still exist in the database. When using context, a context is a PHP class. It provides the executable code for your test. It has functions in it, and the functions are matched to your Gherkin steps using either regex or a bit simpler matching. And if you use Symfony, these contexts can be auto-wired, so you can use part of your application, part of Doctrine, inside your context. Starting a new context, you need a context class, which implements the Behat context. And you need to make sure that Behat knows that it's actually there. And you do that by adding it to your YAML file. Next, you need to make sure that Gherkin can actually match a step. In this case, there's a given there's a user with an email address. You can do the matching with annotation. It starts with @given. There's also @then and @when. But technically, it doesn't really matter which one you use. That's just semantics. They will always match in any case. You can see the colon email. That's the variable that's used in this case. So in this case, if you have a different email address, it will still match that same line. And it will use that variable as a parameter in your function. If you have a bit more complex steps, a bit more optional things in there, you can also do it with regex, if you're comfortable with that. The matching is more or less the same, but it works on the regex groups that you define inside your string. You don't have to write all of these contexts yourself. Because of open source, there's a lot of context already available for you, especially for the API part. And the only contexts that we write are the contexts that are for our specific domain. So we have a user context and a task context and whatever else. The open source contexts that we use come from the Behat project, or a forked version of that, and are mainly REST, Mink, and JSON. The REST context gives us a way to call upon endpoints in different versions, even with a body. The Mink context will give us a bit of information about browsing and the request itself without the JSON part around it, to check status codes or set headers. The JSON context will give us some helpful checks for JSON responses. A check if something is JSON or not. Really helps if you forget a debug. You can check lists of items and count the amount of members in it. Or you can do actual tests on if a specific node has a specific value. You can also do JSON schema validation, which is very handy if you have multiple endpoints that look the same. You can tag your tests. Tagging can be done in 2 layers. You can either tag a scenario with a ampersand above it, and then any kind of string as long as it's unique. Or you can tag features, which is the same as tagging each and every scenario inside that feature. We use those tags for skipping tests sometimes. We end up with endpoints that are heavily reliable on a third-party API. And because we're an agency, we don't really have time to make an entire mock or a fake out of that API. We don't really want to call that external API from our testing CI, so we skip those in our CI tests. And we just run them manually if we need to. You can skip tags by adding the tile in front of the tag name. This is how you do it for the CLI point of view, but you can also do it by default in your behat.yaml file. Next up, hooks. A hook is a bit of executable code that is inside your context, that is executed before each suite, each feature, scenario, or step. And you can use those, for example, to set generic headers. We work with JSON, which means that each and every request that we do needs to have a accept header and a content type header. And if we don't, we get really, really weird error messages. And you can spend hours time trying to debug those. We do this before each scenario. So we have an add before scenario hook, and this function will be executed before each scenario is executed. Sometimes you need a bit more information. So each before, after hook has a scope. This is a class that's supplied by Behat itself. Each scope is a little bit different because not all scopes have the same information. And in this case, we use this scope to get context together in order to get one context to be used within another. We do this by using the get environment and get context method. This method picks a fully qualified class name. You can combine tags and hooks together, which means that a hook will then only be called upon the scenarios that are tagged with a specific tag. In this case, we want to reset the database within each before each test, but not in all cases. There are some scenarios in which you would like to maybe keep the database state. And this way you can actually tell Behat, I want to reset the database, but not every single time, only when I tag either a feature or a scenario. Backgrounds are a specific type of scenario. They are defined within a feature. They run before each scenario inside that feature. So it's like a generic setup. And they are executed after the before scenario tags are fired. An example is this. You define your feature for editing tasks, and each scenario inside that feature should have a user and a task that is created by that user that we can use in further testing. This way, we don't have to put these two lines in each and every scenario that we write in this feature. Scenario outlines are a little bit differently. You can write an outline and see it as a template. You write your test, and inside that test you have placeholders for specific variables, and then you have a set of examples which tells you which variables to use. This is very similar to a data provider in PHP unit. You write your outline as you would write any other scenario, but you make sure that there are some variables in there. And then you have your example set with the same variables in it, and then the values that you use inside those variables. In this case, we use this a lot for validation. So we validate if our registration gives us an error, in case any of the following samples will be true. We set the default email and password first, and then we override that in specific cases with an empty email or an invalid email, an empty password. And then we check if the test itself will actually respond with a 422 instead of a nice 200 or 201. So to make sure that our validation schemas are still in order. Running Behat from the CLI. You can just run vendor bin Behat or Behat, and then it shows you in all of your steps, all of your tests. Each step is green until it's not. And in the end, you get a very nice summary of how many tests you ran, how many tests failed, which test failed, and then you have to scroll back up to see what the hell went wrong. One of the things I use a lot while actually working on code, I write my test before I write my endpoint, and I use the stop on failure option. This option will make sure that Behat stops executing tests as soon as the first one fails. You can fix that, and then rerun it again all the way until it hits the end. You can also just test one feature file very easily, or a directory of feature files by using a path. And if you want to run a specific single test, you use the colon and the line number, and then it runs that test and that test only. Lastly, if you don't like to have the pages and pages and pages of green, some people don't like it, you can use the -- format as progress, and you get the same kind of output as you have with PHP unit. So the dots and the Fs. When you're using JSON schema checks, make sure that you set all of the properties and objects as required. If you do not, a schema check will not complain if anything is missing. Because by default, any property in your JSON object can also be non-existing. And besides that, you want to have the additional property set to false. If you do not do this, JSON schema will also not complain about properties that are there that you didn't describe. This will save you from accidentally leaking all of your attributes instead of only the ones that you want to expose. One final thing is that if you use a self-signed certificate for your HTTPS on localhost, I run multiple projects at work, and I really hate having to remember which port goes where. So I made sub domains, which just point to localhost. And I run HTTPS on that with a self-signed certificate. You need to tell the browser kit that that certificate is there, else you get all kinds of warnings. Why do we use Behat this way? Why are we running this? Well, the feature files are readable. You can actually get your feature files and send them to either a front-end developer or a project manager, or if you want to, even a customer. They can read it. They can understand what's going on if they know a little bit about the web. And especially your front-end developers, they can they really can see what to expect, how your application will behave, and how they are supposed to interact with your application. You always have the correct database state. It's the one reason why I started using Behat is because at some point I started using endpoints where I had to delete something, and somewhere in that process it didn't really work well. I was still using Postman. I had to go back into the database, add a record by hand, add records connected to that record by hand. That's my thing. Okay, some of the stuff got deleted, the rest didn't, and I had to go back into the database and reset the entire state by hand. It took me so much time. This saves a lot of it. You can test through your entire application, and that includes routing, that includes a bit of your network, that includes your configuration. So in those cases that someone accidentally forgot something in your security.yaml file, and some write check wasn't done properly, you can catch it. And unit testing fails to find that. We check both the API response and the database in the end. We make sure that not only that what the API says happened, but we can also see it happen in the database. So not just, okay, I get a 200 and everything is okay and things changed, but we also make sure that it changed in the database. It happened to me before. We had some kind of a endpoint that would alter a state of a task, mark it as completed, and then in the end, the API itself did its work. The endpoint worked, the status was okay, the response had a new status in it, and then the database did it, because I forgot to persist my stuff. It happens, so you do want to test your database. There's a good integration with PHP Storm. You actually have a very nice autocompletion. It's not 100% perfect, but it works. There's a click-through from your feature files to your context, which is really nice. And there's an automated way to add steps into your context. It will default to the regex version, so if you're not comfortable with regex, feel free to rewrite everything, but it's there. And for me, it gives me confidence. With my Behat tests, I know that my stuff works. I know that I can deploy on Friday. Heck, I can schedule a deployment on Friday evening while I'm having a beer and I'm offline. I know that my stuff works. I know that all of the scenarios that I have are covered. So I can just deploy. And it shows. Lately, the CEO of our company tried to force me to see some of the positive things. And one of them was that since we started using this, the amount of bugs that we have in our backend applications is almost negligible. The only things that go wrong is misinterpretation from us as developers. But the stuff works, and it keeps working. So in conclusion, Behat is a tool. Like any other tool, you can use it. You don't have to, but you can. It doesn't replace unit testing. It enhances. So it works in tandem with your already existing tests. Talk to your team, most important part. If you start using Behat and the rest of your team goes like, I don't know what this is, I don't want to use this, you're going to have a bad time. Make sure everyone is on board with this. And if you have QA, include them in this. They can help you write tests. They can help you figure out scenarios. They can help you check if you missed anything. And think very well about what you want to test. Sometimes you don't have to test everything. Sometimes you do. One of the most important things that we test, well, we work at an agency, so budget is a thing. We have customers and they don't really want to pay for testing. So what we test is the most important parts. We test security things, we test the happy trail, we don't test all of the validation, we don't test all of the filters and sorting that we have in our lists, but we do test security. Any questions?
Do you do the database reset in every scenario?
Yeah. Yeah, the question was, do we do the database reset in every scenario? We don't really have to, but we normally do. We had a couple of cases years ago where we didn't, but nowadays we actually always reset the database. We use Truncate for that. We have a little bit of a script that asks Doctrine which tables are there. We make sure that the migration table is not in that list. And then we truncate all of those tables at the same time. And that it doesn't slow down the process that much.
Okay, thanks.
I found it difficult to find, well, not difficult, but there's a choice you have to make about how much seeders you make, how much fixtures you load.
Mm-hmm.
So, like certain elements you put in the database always, and then other stuff you can test. But so my applications, we don't test the configuration pages to maintain the same data that is in the fixtures. How do you do this?
We have a couple of projects that have fixtures. And those fixtures we don't touch during this test. And in the test themselves, we make sure that everything that we need to run the test is in the given part. So each test has their own mini fixture in order to run that one scenario. I run this on my local machine during the development, so my database is mostly empty, and I run my test for that part that I want to develop. And if I need more, I run the fixtures next to that, and I make sure that I don't run the Behat test in the meanwhile. There are two different things. We did try to use fixtures during the test at some point. One of the first projects that we did, we had a whole bunch of fixtures, and we ran those fixtures before each and every scenario. But the problem with that is that if you want to add another row in your fixtures because of some new scenario that you want to test, you have to go through all of the previous scenarios to make sure that they still work. And I spent hours on end trying to juggle all of the scenarios that we had with one set of fixtures. So in the end, we decided to not use fixtures for testing no more.
Any other question?
Right. Then thank you. If you have more questions, if you would like to see how it works, if, I don't know, you want a demo, let me know. I'm also you can also find me on social media, and I have a little demo project with the code that I used in the slides. It's an actual working project. There's no front end for it. It's just back end. The Behat tests work. All of the other stuff, I'm not really sure about. It's a simple Symfony project with just users and tasks, a bit of login, and that's it. You can find it on GitHub. The QR code also links to that.
Thanks.
All right.
Thank you.
That was Timo Bakx.